I'm just gonna share with you some of the perspectives that I like to bring to the conversation as we're talking about going from vulnerability to viability. So I'm not gonna use any slides, and I was hoping that there will be some introductory slide that you can put on the screen if you like, but otherwise we're just gonna chat with each other. But I thank Dr. Das for covering the different aspects that you're doing with your research, covering especially the various sustainable development goals. And I think that's where I like to begin. We know that, well, we have been looking at sustainable development goals for some time now. And starting 2021, of course, there's going to be the United Nations Ocean Decade, right? The Decade of Ocean Science. I think that's officially the name. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of opportunities to be able to do many things, but that would require change, the kind of change that Prateep mentioned earlier as well, starting from the changes that we would need to recognize in terms of environmental climatic change, but and then change that affecting the society and the economy and how we would organize communities and etc. But the kind of change that has to go along with, if we want to achieve all those SDG goals, if we wanted to really do better with ocean and fisheries sustainability, whether that's ocean or inland fisheries, we would need to see change also in the way we think about policy and governance. So since 2014, we have endorsed the small scale fisheries guidelines. So, India is a major player in endorsing and adopting and developing the small scale fisheries guidelines. And you know that the small scale fisheries guidelines are really based on human rights based approach. It invites us to think about many other principles that are very comprehensive and holistic. Well, focusing a lot on making sure that the rights, especially the tenure rights of small scale fisheries, are secured, that they have access to resource and markets, and that is what SDG 14 Target B is about. So there are many interests also in looking at small scale fisheries in terms of gender equity, gender equality. It is also about developing good social work and condition, and also work environment and health and safety issue. It is a lot to do with providing opportunity for small-scale fishing organizations to participate in governance. It doesn't happen just on its own, of course. It would require that governments and other key governing actors get together and think about what will be required in order to implement the small-scale fisheries guidelines, given that they are voluntary. So when things are not mandatory, the countries don't need to do them. But if they are voluntary, it doesn't mean that countries would be let off the hook, so to speak, if they don't do them. So FAO, for instance, has now requesting member states to start reporting on what they are doing to implement the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And that is reported to the COFI, the Committee on Fisheries, when they meet every other year in Rome. So countries are encouraged to do it, but countries actually are facing a lot of challenges in figuring out how to go about implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So I'd like to just bring a few of the ideas and the learning and the lessons that we have when we have done the research in thinking, in assessing globally the challenges and the limitations that countries have. And perhaps we can get a little bit of conversation with, learning also from India in terms of what you have been doing. So a couple of things that we need to keep in mind is that the same thing that we see change happening in other sphere, we also been seeing a bit of transition and reform that is happening around the world when it comes to governance. So we're talking about moving, in some cases, from a hierarchical system, top-down governance system, into more participatory. And in some case, it's also involving a lot of decentralization and self-governance system. But the majority of the countries that we have assessed in 34 case studies around the world that we did within the Too Big to Ignore project that I am involved in. This is the work that I work with Professor Sven Jentoft and many others. This assessment of using the interactive governance framework really reveals that the majority of the countries are in that transition, moving towards much more participation, much more participatory governance system, which is a really good news because, like I said, small scale fisheries guidelines cannot be implemented from a top-down perspective. It really requires a lot of participation from many actors to really move it along. So one thing is about increasing participation, enhancing that involvement and engagement with various stakeholders and actors that we see very well. Aligning with that, of course, is about the way governments are implementing various rules and regulations and other institutions to help moving along the governance system. Here is a little bit tricky, simply because when you started to align principles within the small-scale fisheries guidelines and the principles underlying the rules and regulations that countries are using in the way they manage the fisheries, now we start to see a little bit of disconnect, if you like, because the rules and regulations that countries are using to implement the guidelines are usually put there to control or to either the effort or the input control or the output control in the fisheries. So there are not enough rules and regulations that would be putting in the system to enable small-scale fisheries to secure rights, to be able to get access to resources, to be able to participate fully in the fisheries in a meaningful way, so that they have their own control of the fisheries. So that is where we see a little bit of disconnect. And it could begin perhaps from the way we define small-scale fisheries, because countries put in definition of small-scale fisheries in a way that can help them manage and regulate the small-scale fisheries in the most straightforward way. And the definition of small-scale fisheries don't always include the whole characteristics of small-scale fisheries. And therefore, it doesn't enable small-scale fisheries to be able to fully engage in small-scale fisheries, and again, have access to resources or secure access to resources. So a lot of consideration would need to take place in order to see how we can secure better access to resource. So I think that is, two main observations that I like to make, and I'm gonna wrap up with saying that there is a little bit of work to be done on aligning better the legal framework and the policy framework within the country so that it can correspond well with the principles in the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And I want to just draw attention to one thing in particular, which is related to social justice. And that is a major, major consideration. And I think these would be fundamental when we're talking about going from vulnerability to viability. So we need to be able to provide very good and just policy and institution in order to help small scale fisheries transition towards viability. So why don't I stop there? And well, I think my time is up anyway. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to further discussion about this.